Okay, in part 2 of the week 6 lectures, I'm going to talk about youth culture. So I've, over the previous few weeks, been talking about class and consumption, and so you'll see some of the similar themes coming through into this, and I'm going to just use youth culture as a way of kind of drawing some of those concepts out and I suppose relating them to some actual examples. So youth culture is a particularly important part of youth studies. It's, if we can think of an oversimplification, there's kind of youth transitions that look at like school to work transitions and young people moving out of the house and relationships and stuff like that. And then on the other side, there's kind of the cultural things that people do for leisure and creativity and stuff like that. There's been a kind of false dichotomy between those things, and those things are coming more together more recently. But the youth culture side of things is just kind of looking at the kind of leisure practices, the creative practices, the artistic practices, the consumption practices of young people. So young people tend to have their own spaces and places and things to do that are kind of different than older people. There is a kind of lot of research today that shows that maybe not as much as previous generations where people maybe have given up those things as they got older and more conservative. It seems that people are maybe doing aspects of their youth culture later into life, but they do it differently. But they tend to have their own leisure pursuits, their own kind of, relationships to different, say, social media technologies. But these things are heavily inflected by social distinctions and inequalities, such as class and gender and race. So there's also kind of different ways of thinking about youth cultures in terms of where they happen. You can look at, say, what's happening in the playground at a high school, or you can look at more kind of specific things such as, a particular music genre that happens in, say, old abandoned warehouses and raves and stuff like that, or, punk gigs. Or you can look at things that happen in the house, and particularly the gender critique of a lot of early youth culture work was showing how young people's culture was only studied if it was happening in public, and it left out a lot of stuff that was going on in home, and that kind of constructed a false gender division. In terms of the stuff we looked at in previous weeks, certainly kind of Bourdieu is useful for thinking about distinctions that happen here, and habitus, the way that you're brought up, what you're familiar with is more likely to lead you to different kind of youth cultural practices, different, maybe fashion, different music tastes, different people that you want to hang around with. But one thing that youth culture work has been really good at, I think, highlighting is that, particularly for young people that feel marginalised, that are treated unequally or feel out of place or don't necessarily stack up to what it means to be normal, which, is things like hegemonic masculinity and emphasise femininity. They're kind of alternate youth cultures, particularly subcultures and other kind of terms for that, are ways for those people that feel excluded and marginalised or insulted or bullied to find other people like them and have some kind of creative relationships with people and find other people like them that they can get along with and have social relationships with. So youth cultures is a kind of really fertile ground for analysing lots of different social relations. So why youth cultures? It's definitely a good way of looking at consumer choice in terms through all those theories we were looking at in previous weeks. It's certainly a key area where young people start to kind of understand their own identity, perform their identity, and think about themselves in relation to their own self-identity to broader social identities. And as I said, it's kind of ways of understanding kind of refuge from different kind of developmental and problematic aspects of growing up, loneliness and bullying, senses of alienation and things like that. Youth cultures is kind of a good way of thinking about that Bourdieu thing, how taste classifies, and it classifies the classifier. And when we're making those taste classifications, we're more likely to want to kind of hang around and be with people, be friends with people, develop sexual relations with people that are like us, that like the same things and want to participate in the same practices. For some studies, they tend to then look at these kind of areas of youth cultures, particularly the more alternate subculture type ones, as being resistant to some of the kind of mainstream dominant ideas of society. So in this way, youth cultures are also an interesting way to think about how young people do politics. Again, there's lots of moral panics about how young people aren't interested in politics and they don't care about stuff, and even the critique of that shows that they don't care more or less than kind of the general population. But what it does show is that young people do invest themselves in things and express their politics in all kinds of different ways that largely, isn't represented in mainstream politics anyway. So throughout the previous weeks, we've looked at the Frankfurt School, and I introduced subcultures a little bit in the previous week on consumption as well. In some ways, they're quite similar. They're both interested in pop culture and consumer culture. They're both influenced by Marx in many ways, but also lots of other perspectives. But they tend to have different conceptions of ideology and of the way that kind of youth culture and pop culture and consumer cultures, I suppose, express ideology. The Frankfurt School mostly sees those things as being repressive and commercial, as I unpacked last week, but where the Birmingham School kind of agrees with that in a way with the kind of more mainstream consumption, but says that these kind of particular kinds of doing youth culture are more rebellious and subversive, creative and artistic. So they tend to be analysing the same thing and have sometimes similar things to say, but what's interesting is the Birmingham School people in particular were ethnographers. Frankfurt School were largely philosophers, didn't really do social research, but where the Birmingham School are people that kind of go out into kind of punk spaces or whatever and actually do observations, see what's going on. In fact, many of the original kind of Birmingham School researchers were actually participant observations in their own kind of youth cultures in a way. So they tend to have a more insider point of view and therefore kind of understand those codes a little bit better. That doesn't necessarily mean that they, are objectively right. They just kind of can shine a different light on what's going on in those spaces than someone that's kind of looking at them from the outside. So people like Stuart Hall, Dick Hebertage, Paul Willis, Angel McRobbie are the kind of key names in this Birmingham School. Pioneered in the 70s, was known as the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, but became more colloquially known as the Birmingham School. They studied what they come to call youth subcultures. So in terms of what that means, we have a kind of broader culture happening in a particular country, I suppose, and what they argued is there's particular subcultures that do things differently to kind of create an opposition to that broader mainstream normal culture. Sometimes they mightn't be necessarily doing this kind of resistance deliberately, but it kind of becomes intrinsic part of these practices. What's interesting about this, that rather than the kind of Frankfurt School idea of, people participating in pop and consumer culture being kind of cultural dupes and not really knowing what's good for them, the Birmingham School start to think about this in terms of a politics of pleasure. You can kind of channel your resistive, artistic, subversive impulses into these practices. And what they become is like not a way of kind of creating a revolution in that Marxist sense, but a way of creating kind of space of relative autonomy, relative freedom, I suppose, from some of those more mainstream, overt, normalising structures. So this sees pop and consumer culture, and we're looking at youth culture particularly here, as a site of struggle. Not necessarily as a site of overt ideology, but a place where there's kind of debates and struggles going on about what things mean and how to live. So this gives some kind of importance to things like music and fashion and taste, to be able to express yourself beyond ideology, or at least to challenge it in some way. So pop culture here becomes a contested site for political constructions of the people. As I was talking about last week as well, the resistance here isn't necessarily organising a new society or, starting a mass revolution. It's more symbolic. It happens through everyday rituals and happens through the process of bricolage that I outlined last week. Not necessarily challenging the system as a whole, but creating a measure of autonomy to live within it. So importantly here, and a key distinction from the Frankfurt School to the Birmingham School, is that cultural practices in this sense become a site of practice, a site of doing things, as much as a kind of site of consumption, of just kind of being passive and receiving things. There's more creativity involved in youth cultures in this sense than just kind of consuming things blindly. So punk is one of the key early subcultures that were studied in terms of this perspective, and Dick Hebdage's book on subculture, The Meaning of Style, is a kind of foundational text around this. So you can see some kind of key images there, the kind of typical Sex Pistols stuff. So at this point, I'd like you to have a quick look at the video here, which is the first 5 or 6 minutes of the documentary about the Sex Pistols, called The Filth and the Fury. And what it is, it's Johnny Rotten kind of narrating the genesis of punk. And you'll see here that he's kind of almost invoking subculture theories here about why punk happened. So I'll just get you to have a quick look at that. Okay, so what does subculture theory have to say about punk? It basically starts to kind of analyze this social creative movement as a way of expressing distaste and rebellion against what was going on in Britain at the time. Now, those that are familiar with history of punk, there's all kinds of debates about whether it started in, London and Manchester, or whether it started in New York and that kind of thing. So that kind of more musicology thing isn't that important here. What is important about the practices that were happening around this, the different subcultures and scenes that developed, and the ways that the people participating in them, imagined what they were doing and what were their intentions, I suppose. So subcultural theorists start associating punk with working class people that are kind of rebelling against, new conservative politics from Thatcher in Britain at the time. You can see in the video that, there's garbage strikes, there's all kinds of horrible things going on. And the way that these people then narrate what's going on is that they are expressing themselves against this. They're creating a kind of way of life that is both more to their own tastes and lifestyle, but also kind of symbolically rebels against much of the stuff going on. How do they do that? They wear safety pins as earrings. They have extreme haircuts, get tats, wear leather jackets and all that kind of stuff. They symbolically mark themselves as outsiders, and they do this deliberately as a kind of political expression. So this happens then through the gigs. It becomes like what media that theorist Douglas Rushkoff called a media virus, where it kind of spreads more outside of that initial place, moves beyond London and Manchester and New York, and becomes different scenes all across the world. In fact, some people argue that the first punk song was actually the Saints in Brisbane, that happened before the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and the like. So that's the kind of story of what's going on around subcultures and punks in the way that it's analysed through that sense. But then we can ask a bunch of other questions, more critical questions, I think, since that analysis. So can something like punk be a form of true rebellion or subversion if, it's really about, buying records or going to gigs? Is it a form of pseudo-rebellion in that sense? Does a spectacular image make it more subversive or more open to commercial exploitation? And, you can see the original punks, I suppose, that were living kind of gritty DIY lifestyles and squats and stuff like that. And really, in terms of at least mainstream culture, the way punk is represented today, bands like Good Charlotte or Blink-182 or whatever that aren't really like that. So you could argue that therefore the image of punk has been used to keep selling music, but really the political sensibility has been taken out of it. So these are kind of, research questions then to think beyond that kind of initial subcultural theory. So, can punk be seen as authentic, or is it really now being co-opted to the point where it's almost meaningless? And there's a lot of kind of interesting writing about that kind of stuff. In this sense, the attitudes and politics that were punk becomes kind of more of a symbol to be kind of sold rather than actually living a life as a punk. So the subcultural theories were really important to kind of start taking what young people were doing seriously. And beyond subcultural theory, in terms of looking at more mainstream behaviours, we can see this kind of taste stuff playing out as well. And a really, I think, excellent study by Stephen Miles, done in the late 90s, talked about how young people are constantly under pressure in and around youth cultures to both fit in and stick out. There's both a sense of conformity in all kinds of, high school playgrounds or, sporting teams or whatever, but also young people within those conforming spaces often will do small things to kind of, stick out and express their individuality. This can be even against subtle things like at high schools where, a uniform is relatively strictly policed. People might, kids might roll up one sleeve or wear a badge or something to kind of rebel against that in their own way. So this again becomes kind of a way of thinking about that pseudo-individuality that Adorno talks about. There's certainly aspects of that constantly in youth cultures, but there's also ways, you know, realistically, how else are people meant to express themselves other than finding these small, everyday ways to rebel? Importantly, as I mentioned already at the start, that that original subcultural theories were kind of almost critiqued instantly by one of the original theorists, Angela Morobi, as being largely looking at male cultures, where women were given kind of secondary roles or weren't in them at all. And as McRobbie pointed out, it's because the original subcultural theorists tended to focus on youth cultures that were happening in public space and didn't really look enough at what was going on in the more private sphere, in bedrooms and homes and things like that. So a particular kind of early like subculture that was dominated by females was riot girl, something that I myself was really into in the 90s. And again, this is a kind of, I think, a really good example of expressing politics through cultural practices. So I've got some examples, videos there if you're unfamiliar with what riot girl is, and some quotes, but you can check that out and watch those videos in your own time. But essentially, riot girl was like a feminist challenge to punk spaces that were dominated by men, feminist challenge to what was happening at gigs where there was kind of high rates of sexual assault and stuff like that. And even a kind of feminist critique of the co-optation of punk and the way that it's kind of sold back to the audience with an inflated price. Since the original subculture theories, there's been lots of other ways to think about young people, particularly as the original subculture theory was kind of seen as being too specific to those kind of, you know, very niche practices. So there's terms like neo-tribes. Also, there's analysis of how these subcultural or neo-tribe practices moved online. There's stuff that looks at kind of post-subcultural approach that ties things less to class, and kind of points out how really the way that young people identify with different cultures is more kind of fluid and unstable than kind of just taking on the label of a punk or a goth or whatever. So are these recent manifestations more or less politically charged? Again, that's another research question in youth studies. And I mentioned the kind of aging youth cultures thing already. Okay, so I'll hold the youth culture stuff there, and in the next section I'll be talking about youth transitions.